Thank you very much, Alexander, for this kind introduction. And thank you also for inviting me. And thank you also, Nele, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to come back to fisheries, because I haven't been working on fisheries like for the last 3 years, basically. But I was asked to come and speak, and I thought about, what can I offer? What do I have to say with regards to resource responsibility and the EU? And I immediately came back to a topic that intrigued me from early on when I started to deal with fisheries and research on fisheries. And I will start, it will be an exploratory talk, a little bit like my predecessor did, and I will ask questions and I will come up with, and I try to solve a very, or bring order to a very fuzzy discourse. And it has a lot to do with the effects of international trade on resource responsibility in the area of fisheries, and maybe with the European, or particularly with the European contribution to this, and the European trade policy's possible contribution to this. Okay, those of you who are not from Hamburg, this is a picture of the sign which points to the Altona fish market, which is a very famous fish market in Europe, and particularly, of course, in Hamburg and in Germany. It used to be the trading place for fish in Germany for hundreds of years, and it's probably one of the oldest maritime fish markets in Germany, and it dates back to the 14th century, and at that time, Hamburg and Altona were still two cities. And of course, today, this is why I used the picture as a starting point for my talk, just want to use it as a means of contrast, because today, fisheries trade is very, very different from what you can see when you look at the old history of trading places. Today, fisheries trade has become a global business on virtual markets, and it generates a net worth of 143 billion in 2016. 32% of all produced and caught fish enter the export, and roughly 60 million tons are being traded every year. Trade relations have become complex, and traders are located all over the world. And trade in fish and fishery products is extensive and shapes global production and consumption patterns. Accordingly, governance or regulation of trade in fish and fish products provides an avenue or an opportunity or a means to make an important contribution towards resource responsibility. So in my presentation, I will try to inquire how the EU's trade policies and laws concerning fisheries products fit into this picture, whether or to what extent they can be regarded as resource responsible, and what can possibly be its contribution to resource responsibility. Perfect. So very briefly, I will give an overview. First of all, I would try to introduce a reference point for what can be regarded, or a reference point for resource responsibility in the area of fisheries. I will then try to define what trade in fisheries products actually includes, because that is a little bit tricky because of some law of the sea issues, and how the topic can be related to resource responsibility. I will also look at the EU fisheries trade regime and try to assess which aspect of it can be regarded as resource responsible, and where there possibly might be certain pathways or avenues to improve the system. All right. Well, it's fair to say, and I would just like to briefly remind us of what resource responsibility in fishery means, and it's very well captured and represented by the 14th SDG, and we've seen it today already in the talk of Alike. And what it says basically is that fisheries is one aspect of managing uses and conservation of the oceans and the seas. fisheries policies used to be very much concentrated on stocks and the effects fishing activities have on stocks. But over the years, over the last couple of decades, environmental aspects and requirements were increasingly being taken into considerations. And the ecosystem approach emerged, the precautionary principle emerged. So in a sense, that is very clear. Fishing is part or is taking place in a marine environment that has to be used and conserved. So Target 14 provides a more specific reference level, and that is, of course, the maximum sustainable yield. And it's not only SDG 14, but it's a lot of international legal instruments which also refer to the maximum sustainable yield as a reference point for fisheries management. It's national laws, it's UNCLOS, it's the FSA agreement from 1995, it's the Code of Conduct, it's European law, it's New Zealand law, you name it, Japanese law. You will find the MSY level in fisheries science and, of course, in the law. But to sum it up, it's MSY levels, maximum sustainable yield levels, as, and accompanied by natural or environmental requirements which need to be considered. So where are we now? Every 2 years, the FAO publishes its huge report on the status of world or global fisheries stocks, and it just also switched its nomenclature to so-called fully fished criteria into the MSY criteria, and it says that almost 60% of all commercially exploited stocks are fully fished at MSY levels. So you could say that it's sustainable, but it's a very rough assessment in a sense, and it does not necessarily take into consideration ecosystem requirements. 7% are fished below MSY levels. That means, or that leaves 33% are being fished beyond maximum sustainable yield levels. And that can mean a lot. That can mean that they are already outside safe biological limits, which make them collapse more or less, or could lead to their collapse, or it could be just a little bit above the MSY level. It's a very rough assessment, as I say. But so here we are seeing these numbers, and the FAO clearly states that fishing pressure is increasing. It has stabilized through the 90s, early 90s at some huge number, but in a sense, it is very easy to see that these numbers will, or that the fishing pressure will increase. We will have more people, we have rising living standards in many parts of the world, and we have an increasing technology, or better technology for hunting down the last fish stocks, or not the last fish stocks, but the fish stocks. And some fisheries scientists say that these numbers of the FAO are overly optimistic. So there is a sense of urgency here. Okay, trade in fisheries products. When we want to find out what trade has to do with fishing pressure or the use of fisheries resources, we really need to take a brief moment and look what falls within this topic. And in general, you could say that's imports and exports. Either fisheries products are consumed or processed within one country in which they have produced or where they have been caught, or they enter the export and are sold to other countries. Because of, this would also include, and that's like the law of the sea aspect to it, if a vessel carrying a third country flag is landing directly their catch in European ports, this would be part of the trading regime. It also includes imports from EU companies' subsidiaries which are located in third countries, and it would also, if I'm not mistaken, all imports from overseas territories. We have an expert on fisheries here from the European Commission. He might he might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this includes imports from overseas territories. So, what does not fall within the remit of the trade policy? But that's, of course, I mean, for all of you, you're law of the sea lawyers, or you're familiar with the law of the sea, but if you would give this talk to environmental lawyers, you would really have to explain it to them. Of course, it does not include those ships which have or carry the flag of a member state and which go out and fish in the territorial waters, the EEZs, on the high seas, or in the EEZs of third countries where this fishing is based on access agreement. A lot of people include subsidization into the topic of fisheries trade. Subsidies have a strong effect on trade, obviously, but for example, from a European law perspective, subsidies have many other functions and purposes. They have environmental purposes, they have labor market purposes, they have structural purposes, and they are more seen as part of the structural policies and not necessarily directly included into the topic into the frame of the trade policies. But in many contexts, like the WTO, trade agreements include the topic of subsidies, but we will treat subsidies a little bit less here. So, just very briefly, now, as I said, 30% or 35% of global fish production enter international trade. And this graph roughly shows you the amount which is being exported by developing countries and the amount which is being exported by developed countries. What this graph doesn't show you is where the fish is being imported, basically, and who is gaining a lot of fisheries products from international trade. And it's really interesting to see that the European Union is getting 26% of all the fisheries products which are being traded globally. Was importing 26% of all global imports, or traded goods. And 60% of the fish consumed in the EU is from outside the EU. It's caught or produced outside the EU. In Germany, actually, is, I think, much more than 80%. So, in fact, the trade regime of the EU covers a huge proportion of the world's traded fish. The trade deficit is also visible in countries like Japan and the US, but as I said, the EU is a special case because it really gets a huge proportion of the world or globally traded fisheries goods. Now, are high import rates really an issue for resource responsibility? Sorry. Well, there is a rising demand in fisheries products. And on the other side, we see heavily exploited stocks. And there's a tension in it. It at least evokes the question whether there is a problem. And this discussion is being ongoing for a long time, and I've always wanted to come back to it because it always seemed blurry to me, and the arguments are very much emotionally, or you could say even ideologically, being discussed. Well, in general, you could say that there's some basic, or one group of people really sees it critical, and the other group is, believing in free trade and the benefits of free trade. And several arguments circle around these basic assumptions. And those who see it, kind of believe in the positive effects of international trade in fisheries products, like, for example, in the WTO negotiations or in the FAO, certain benefits of international trade are being emphasized. And that is, for example, that international trade in fisheries products creates foreign exchange for developing countries, large nutritional gains in export countries. It creates trickle-down effects in export countries, and it can serve as a motivation for sustainable management in export states. In addition, increasing options or international trade increases options for consumers in import countries, and it allows access to fisheries resources for those states who have no fish resources or are geographically disadvantaged. The other group more or less points out the possible negative effects. And there are three main arguments. And the one is that international trade creates an unfair distribution globally of high valuable food resources. And there's two narratives around this, which basically you could summarize in first, the rich people get all the good food, while the poor get the remains. And the second one is the EU or other economic powers have used up their resources and are now increasing the fishing pressure via the mechanism of the world market in other areas. The second argument is that world trade creates an unfair competition between those industries in these exporting countries which are export-oriented versus the small-scale artisanal fisheries. And that small-scale fishers in exporting countries very often do not gain the benefits of global trade. So what do we actually know? If these discourses are very blurry, and the people who kind of agree with each other, they keep on talking to each other, and they seem to justify their thoughts in many ways, and it's kind of self-referential. So what I found, and this is a preliminary analysis, I would say that this is research in progress and things need to be very much empirically and systematically be inquired. From the few studies that I have seen, both types of effects are visible. But as I say, many studies or arguments or articles are more anecdotal. Both types of effects are visible in some cases. So what seems to be true is that the globalization of markets, and this is very tentative here, seems to contribute to increasing fishing pressure at last. Markets rather seem to have a catalytic effect, both for positive and negative effects, and that the effects of trade depend to a large extent on the national management system of the exporting country. So this is preliminary assessment from what I can find. Now, how does the EU fit into that? The EU, since its inception in the 70s, and basically since the creation of the EEZ and the loss of fishing grounds for European vessels, has a significant undersupply of fish, raw material, and fisheries products. And for political reasons, food supply and promoting the processing industry were really strong objectives of the Commission and the member states in the Council. And so the EU has in general lowered or even abolished many times its tariffs for fisheries products. I forgot to say that in principle, of course, the EU is a custom union and fisheries imports subject to the common custom tariffs. So a lot of times the EU has lowered or abolished tariffs through different types of regulations. Either they're triannual autonomous tariff quotas or multilateral agreements, particularly with the Cotonou states or later economic partnership agreements states, the overseas territories, the parties to the European Economic Area, the 50 least developed countries, and several other African Caribbean states. In total, approximately 2/3 of all imports of fisheries products are subjected to substantially lower or no custom tariff. On the other side, the EU has the opportunity under the market regulation to adopt anti-dumping measures. It has rarely done so, very few times as far as I can see, to protect the processing industry basically. It also, and that's not a tariff measure, it's a the EU has phytosanitary standards for fisheries products, and in principle all imports subject to the same phytosanitary measures as EU products. Some developing countries have argued that these requirements bar market access for their products. And third, and increasingly, the EU adopts regulations which restrict market access for illegal, unregulated and unreported catches. It has started with some tuna imports, bans for tuna imports from specific countries, and now it has, since 2009, the IOU regulation, which basically established a complex system of trying to really restrict market access for those illegally caught products. Oh, sorry. So, taking all this into account, what can the EU do? And as I see it, it's very difficult to say that a liberal import regime really creates negative effects in developing countries or in other countries. What is the role of the EU? A lot of imports to the EU of fisheries products are actually not from developing countries. A large portion comes from Iceland and from Norway and other transitional or developed countries. So Iceland and Norway, of course, cannot be suspected of really managing their stocks badly. They manage them probably more successful than the EU. And so first thing probably to do was to really clarify where EU-initiated trade or imports really create negative effects. And that would probably be in some developing countries. But we need well-designed empirical research on that, and as far as I can see, there's very little out there in this regard. So, but if the EU wants to ensure that their trade policy, their liberal trade policy, does not harm resources, they would have to clarify the effects of their trade policies and their import practices. Fisheries trade is, for a long time, has been also, or the supply of, do I have a little bit? Oh, 5 minutes, perfect. Fisheries imports or supply has been guaranteed by other means. The EU has funded joint ventures, that is, joint ventures of fisheries companies in Europe with fisheries companies in third countries in order to gain access to the certificates, fishing certificates of other countries. It also has funded access agreement, obviously, and there are also, to some extent, private fishing activities outside these access agreements. So it would be really interesting to see to what extent and in what the volume really is of EU activities of EU companies in third countries, and to make an assessment of the effects of these investment policies and fishing activities and trade-related activities of these actors. So the second big step is, and that's probably the only thing really possible, or the strategy that is really possible given this very complex system and the mixed effects of trade policy and international globalization of international trade in fisheries products, is to keep on and intensify the restriction and to make it effective of or restrict imports to sustainable and legal products. Currently, the emphasis is on restricting trade to legal products. But legal products are not necessarily caught sustainably. So this can only be the first step. Make the import regime effective in the sense that it just does not allow in illegally caught fish. And second, to help third countries or important importing states in developing their management system. Because that was one of the things that seemed pretty clear, that if the management system in the exporting country is functioning and viable, export can't harm the local resources. And that would include, actually, to help third countries to achieve the public and increasingly private standards for sustainable fisheries. A lot of developing countries argue now that all these private standardization and certifying and labeling requirements makes market access for them increasingly difficult. So support also small-scale fisheries in getting access to the markets and to let them participate in the benefits of trade. And to also help third countries to prevent IUU fishing, particularly in developing countries, because that's the big challenge, to avoid IUU fishing. Okay, I just need this to say, because every other thing, or to not say, would make an unbalanced picture. It's a very airy objective, but it's important to say that, of course, the EU could reduce global fishing pressures by really trying to improve their own fisheries management. And for a long time, it hasn't been very successful. There's clear signs of change, but yeah, there's room for improvement. So it could, by improving its own management system, reduce the demand pull on the global market. Okay, and finally, I spoke with my colleague in the break. Normally, access agreements include exclusivity clauses that mean that private actors can't get access outside these agreements to third countries' resources. But if there are no exclusivity clauses in these access agreements, it would be very important to get all the external activities of EU actors inside the regulatory framework of these access agreements in order to get a governance grip on it and control and have transparency regarding their actions. Okay, that's from my side. Okay.